Thanks so much for inviting me, Clemens. This is actually a great honor for me. And time goes so fast, you never even notice. I remember so distinctly sitting across from the panelists. But of course, I'm not going to tell you how many years ago that was. So today what I wanted to do is give you a little bit of an overview of my research. And as we go across some of these papers, I also wanted to kind of give you a word of caution on the difficulties of some of the topics. And then at the end, I'm going to have a few pieces of advice. And I was talking to the panelists. I'm so happy that I'm one of the first ones, because as the day drags along, I think some of the pieces of advice is going to be the same. Because ultimately, there are lots of kind of golden rules. There's not a magic pill that you can take that cures everything, but there definitely are golden rules that are worth following. So let me just start with my research a little bit. So I basically study intermediaries a lot, specifically concentrating on delegated portfolio managers. And so within that, I like to kind of divide it into two. A little bit of conflicts of interest, adverse incentives, and also the second part is a little bit more general about how managers kind of generate investment ideas. And of course, not everything falls into these two categories, but broadly speaking, that's kind of what I do. And so I just have a list of papers. I'm not gonna, just so that you know what I'm talking about when I mention some of these papers. So let me start with this conflict of interest line of research. So, in my PhD, I met some great people, and so I started thinking about conflict of interest in delegated portfolios. And so the first few papers I had was on whether hedge fund managers misreport returns. And then I had a great paper with Doctoral later on talking about fund families and whether they have incentives that are different from the incentives of the fund investors. I also had a paper, or now, hopefully the second one is eventually going to come out with Clemens that looks at incentives of delegated portfolio managers in the 401k space. So essentially, kind of the way I think about these papers is you always have to map out managerial incentives. So you have to have a model in mind of the type of managerial incentives that arise from the contracts mostly, and so try to figure out what kind of incentives those generate, and in particular, kind of what are the footprints that you're going to find in reported returns, in the type of services that provide, and everything else. So in some sense, the difficulty with this kind of research is that some of these papers are hard to sell. So essentially, referees and editors are going to be cautious. They don't want to, if you have circumstantial evidence, they're going to be a little bit, wary about whether they're going to be willing to run that paper or not. And that's completely, understandable. And really, in these kind of papers, you never have a smoking gun. You have, you do the best job you can to bring in as much circumstantial evidence as you can, but it's still just circumstantial evidence. And so that's kind of where you have to, I think it's great for us to be policing the industry to some extent. As academics, we can actually be more systematic about things. We can go to SEC filings and really have, like I said, more of a systematic approach in terms of what kind of behavior I expect, and kind of look across the firms and funds and everything else. But at the same time, as I mentioned, this is all forensic economics. It's never going to be a smoking gun. So my first paper, for instance, with Nick Boland, we had a really hard time selling it. And so that was before Madoff. And so, everywhere we sent it, the editors were just like, yeah, I don't know. There's nothing wrong with the hedge fund industry. And so, you have to have a bit of luck also, because fortunately, Madoff happened. And then all of a sudden it was much easier to sell stuff. But had I not, had he not been busted, so to speak, I don't know, I probably wouldn't have been able to publish those papers because simply we got a lot of pushback. And even the first paper that we finally published, it was in the JFQA finally, and the only reason is that because the editor happened to be working on a case. Kind of, was in line with what we were saying. And even then, they told us to take all the words out of, the word of fraud, take it all out. So we had to kind of find and replace, to make sure that, that's not going to be there. So that's kind of, so with this kind of research, like I said, I think it's exciting, and Utpal is going to talk probably about the dark side of finance. He has the research agenda that kind of does a similar thing. But as I said, it's you have to be prepared because some of this is going to be hard to start. And the last thing about it is I have a new paper that I'm super excited about. It's on hedge funds again and patent litigation. But so far, we have not gotten really close because we cannot get our hands on good enough data. So all the patterns that we are showing are very, very circumstantial. So we are still hoping to kind of beef it up a little bit before we can circulate it. So that's one. The other thing that is a more broad topic is how managers generate kind of their investment ideas. And I listed just a couple of papers there. That was my early work with my Indiana colleagues back then. And we were interested in those papers in the human element. So the idea was that whether manager or background matters in decision making. And of course in economics you don't, in the early economic models you don't worry about this kind of human effects. And so since then I'm kind of moving away from that because I also wanted to kind of tell you that some of these areas kind of start up, but then we kind of over-research some of these. So back when the literature started on whether managers matter, it was a broad economic question. And so now I think we pretty well established that they do. And so anything after that is going to be somewhat of a narrow question. So sure we know that they matter, but do they matter in this context? So you're really narrowing it down now quite a bit. And so that's kind of, I'm not at the advice slide yet, but this is also a piece of advice. I think, so I'm going to pick on Nora and Maria Sunta because they work on areas that I'm very familiar with, but I think it's true for everybody else. When you look at their papers, there's going to be an overarching big economic question. And so sure, the data may be, so for instance, the paper I discussed for Maria Sunta not long ago, the paper is on money market funds, but the question itself is much broader than money market funds. So that's kind of, I think, what I really like to read, the type of papers I really like to read are the ones that have the broad economic question, and then, the laboratory can be anything, but it's kind of applicable across. So I have kind of a few pieces of advice that I kind of think are important, and I'm going to be kind of quick, but I'm going to connect them together a little bit. So one thing that I think, the first one is don't underestimate good writing. And so there are lots of guides to how to write, and it's not just English, it's writing itself. And so you can, for instance, John Cochrane has a really nice kind of guide on how to make your study good in terms of the writing. Like I said, this has nothing to do with English. It has to do with the style and the type of setup. And I kind of related to this, and right now you might not see how it's related, but I'm going to tell you in a minute. I also think that you should say yes early in your career more than later on. So say yes to referee reports and discussions, and if you do say yes, do a really good job, or as good a job as you can completing those. And the two are related for a positive reason. I think everybody's super busy. So referees, paper reviewers for conferences, editors, everybody is always very busy. And so we actually do, a lot of the times, we do a quick job. First impressions matter a whole lot. And so if you have a really well-written abstract and introduction, then that's going to be a good first impression. Versus if you kind of have a really good idea, but the writing is not that good, then that first impression is bad, and it's going to be really hard to overcome. The same idea with refereeing and discussing. If they see you, do a good job, they kind of have this first impression of, that you're good. And so when your paper goes across, I think that first impression is going to be important. Versus if you don't do a good job, then the paper goes through, and that first impression is going to be hard to overcome. So that's kind of how they are connected in terms of that. So that's kind of my opinion. I already talked about chasing hot topics. I said that sometimes the literature kind of starts out really strong, but then it quickly kind of does that. And I guess the last two pieces of advice is kind of again related. I always think being a good colleague is very important. So when you start in a new department, kind of you don't have to do everything, but kind of chipping in is very important. And simultaneously also ask for help. So I might be biased because at Indiana we had a really strong mentoring kind of culture. And so when I first joined, I could always stop by at, Bob Jennings' office, and he would give me great advice. We could take referee reports to our senior colleagues, and they would help us through this. But that type of help really kind of increase. I would strongly believe increases your probability of success. So I think when you're a good colleague, asking for help is always easier. So those are my kind of pieces of advice, and I hope you guys are going to have a successful career. So thank you.